All right, everybody, we are going to pick up where we left off yesterday. Yesterday, we talked about the Freedom Ride. So today, we got to talk about what happened in Birmingham. We'll talk about the March on Washington, and then we have to look at a few other civil rights leaders of the time. All right, so the campaign in Birmingham. All right, so Martin Luther King Jr. called Birmingham the most segregated city in the country. Now, as a result of this, in 1963, the SCLC decided to focus its attention specifically on Birmingham because virtually no public facilities in Birmingham were actually integrated. All right. On April 12th, Martin Luther King Jr. and 50 other demonstrators were arrested. Okay. They were protesting peacefully. As you can see, you have kids here, probably part of the SNCC, were being shot with water hoses at point blank range. You have other protesters being attacked by police dogs. Certainly not something that you want to be a part of. All right. When I say you don't want to be a part of, I mean you don't want to be shot with a water hose or being attacked by a dog. All right. Now, Martin Luther King, like I said, and 50 other were jailed. And during this time, Martin Luther King Jr. actually wrote a letter, a very famous letter, during his time in jail in Birmingham, which we've already looked at. All right. Now, by late April, the SCLC turned the SNCC to take part in those protests. Okay, so as you can see, you have kids here and kids here. All right. Now, his letter is mainly about civil disobedience, and if you remember, when the SCLC helped create the SNCC, they were training these kids in the idea of civil disobedience, meaning you're not following laws that you deem are unjust. All right. Now, these images that I'm showing you right now were put in newspapers and were circulated all around the United States, either in newspapers or on television. And because of that, the American public was just shocked to see what was happening to these kids and these protesters. Now, on May 10th, the civil rights leaders announced a historic accord in Birmingham because the city agreed for a number of changes, including the desegregation of public facilities within 90 days. All right, but there's always going to be backlash, and there was racist backlash after this. But this was seen as a win for the civil rights movement because, as Martin Luther King Jr. stated, Birmingham was, quote unquote, the most racist city in the United States at the time because literally nothing was desegregated. And because of these protests, because they were using media and civil disobedience and nonviolence, the city bowed down to the protesters' wishes. Now, probably the most famous speech that was given by Martin Luther King Jr. is the 1963 March on Washington. So on August 28th, more than 250,000 people marched on Washington to show their support for civil rights. Now, the most notable event of that day was Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. All right, it was extremely moving and televised. All right, it was put out there on television, so Americans were able to see this speech up close. All right, so I want you to pause the PowerPoint right now, and I want you to watch part of that speech. Okay. Some more civil rights legislation that was passed during the 1960s. All right. Some of them were passed during JFK's time in office. But after he was killed, Lyndon Johnson took over and continued to help pass through the civil rights legislation. Okay, so in 1964, the Civil Rights Act. Okay, the Civil Rights Act will definitely be on your test. It banned discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin. All right, but it didn't outlaw discrimination in housing. So you could still be discriminated against on if you could buy a house or not in certain areas of the world, or not the world, but the United States. The 24th Amendment was passed, which outlawed poll taxes. You no longer have to pay to vote. All right. Then we have Freedom Summer. So in the spring of 1964, CORE and the SNCC campaigned to register black voters in Mississippi. Unfortunately, they met a lot of violent opposition. We see a lot of beatings, shootings, and bombings. Because of that, we get a march on Selma. Okay, there's a movie out there called Selma about the non-violent protests that Martin Luther King Jr. led in Selma, Mississippi. All right, they protested those violent acts to try to get people registered to vote. Okay, now once again, these protests were televised. All right. And this violence that was televised was put out there to the nation, and the majority of the nation said, no, this isn't what we're about. We don't like this. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed all literacy tests, okay, and other tactics that were used to disenfranchise voters, like grandfather clauses. So if your grandfather can vote, you can vote. All right, or you have to prove that you can read in order to vote. Okay, and then federal intervention would ensure that all eligible voters were not turned away. So a lot of this civil rights legislation that was passed through was to enfranchise or give more people the opportunity to vote. All right, chapter 46, the movement is taking a turn. So Martin Luther King Jr. Was the leader of the SCLC. He preached about nonviolence and talked about making sure that it's okay to break laws that you deem as unjust. On the other side of the coin, you have Malcolm X. All right, Malcolm X and black nationalism came out during this time. All right. So just so you know, all right, I used to have everybody make a T-chart and write down 3 ideas for Malcolm X and 3 ideas for Martin Luther King Jr. All right, I think that it's important that you know the difference between the two. All right, radical and militant political leaders of the time emerged outside the main stream civil rights movement, and one of these leaders' name was Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X originally wasn't named Malcolm X. His original name, he was born and named Malcolm Little. But when he joined the Nation of Islam, which was also called the Black Muslims at the time, which preached black separatism and self-help. So Martin Luther King Jr., he wanted equality. All right, he wanted equality. He wanted all of the races living together and basically treating each other like people. All right. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, however, believed in separatism. All right. So he basically said, "Look, I just want, it's almost like he was okay with making sure that the races were segregated. All right. So just leave us alone." All right, so it's okay that we're segregated, just leave us alone. He also believed in self-help, so African-American communities helping each other. Now, as a minister of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X spread his ideas of black nationalism, all right, a belief in which a separate identity and racial unity of the African-American community. So it's separate from the idea that we're all Americans, all right? Malcolm X also believed in the idea of black nationalism. So you have a racial identity, and we should have racial unity as well. Now, in 1964, Malcolm X made a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is the holy city of Islam. Now, while he was there, he saw Muslims of all races praying together, and it changed his views of the idea of separatism. All right, when he came back to the United States, his tone changed. He was no longer preaching the idea that black and whites should be separate. He started preaching that very, very similar to what Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching, that we should be living in unity and we should be able to help each other. Now, because of his change in tune, unfortunately, he was shot and killed in 1965 because of his newly found beliefs. He was actually killed by other members of the Nation of Islam. Now, the leader of the Nation of Islam is right here. His name was Elijah Muhammad. Okay, he believed in that idea of black nationalism. All right, so we should be separate. We have racial unity, self-help, all of that stuff that Malcolm X was preaching. Now, Elijah Muhammad did not believe in seeking political change. He taught that Allah, or the Muslim name for God, would bring about the idea of a black nation, all right, a union among non-white peoples. Okay, he also preached the idea of making sure that people were living righteous lives and becoming economically self-sufficient. So we shouldn't have to depend on, other races to make our way in the world. Now, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, near the end of Malcolm X's life, because Malcolm X came back from Mecca with these new beliefs, there was a rift between Elijah Muhammad and black nationalism and Malcolm X. Then we have the Black Power movement, all right? The SNCC, so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, became a lot more radical later on in the civil rights movement under the leadership of this guy named Stokely Carmichael. And that's a picture of him in the bottom right here. That's Stokely Carmichael. Now, Carmichael advocated the ideas of what was called Black Power, which called upon African Americans to embrace their heritage, build their communities, and lead their own organizations. Now, Black Power fostered racial pride, but also led to a major split in the civil rights movement. So very much like black nationalism, Black Power is talking about building your communities. We shouldn't have to depend upon other races to get where we need to be. All right, so the civil rights movement is starting to crack a little bit. Not everybody is on the same page anymore. Then we have this thing called the Black Panthers, this group called the Black Panthers. That was created in 1966. It was a political party. It was a militant political party. Now, originally when it was created in Oakland, California. And originally it was almost like they were protecting their neighborhoods, and then it just kind of grew from there. All right, the Black Panthers wanted African Americans to lead in their own communities. They also demanded that the federal government rebuild the nation's quote-unquote ghettos. Okay, they also monitored police activity in these ghettos. Okay, they often found themselves at odds and violent encounters with the police. All right. Okay, riots in the streets. So in the early civil rights movement, if you remember the difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation, de jure segregation was racial separation created by law. Now, because of all the laws that we talked about earlier today, de jure segregation was becoming less of a problem. But now we're dealing with de facto segregation becoming the main problem. So the separation was caused by social conditions such as poverty. Now, because of frustration of de facto segregation, especially in underprivileged neighborhoods, it led to riots in several cities, including Detroit. My dad was born in the 1960s, and he remembers he lived in Roseville, which, is 25 minutes or so outside of downtown Detroit. And he remembers the riots that actually happened in Detroit. He remembers seeing just huge black clouds of smoke coming out of Detroit because Detroit was burning because of these riots that were taking place. I want you to pause this, and I want you to watch this quick history video about those Detroit riots. All right. Tragedy strikes in 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. He was mobilizing support for the Poor People's Campaign. Okay, it was an effort to reduce economic injustice. At King's Hotel, he was shot and killed. Now, King's death provoked violent riots in more than 120 cities. Now, following his death, many Americans wound up losing faith in this nonviolent, the idea of nonviolent change. All right, they started to lean a little closer to the ideas of Malcolm X that if I get hit, I should be able to hit you back, essentially. And then we have the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 as well. Okay, now Robert F. Kennedy was a major advocate of civil rights. If you remember, he was the attorney general for his brother and wanted to send down federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. All right. Unfortunately, Kennedy, while he was campaigning in 1968 in California, he wound up being shot and killed. Now, the overall legacy of the movement, so what came out of the movement, this idea of affirmative action, all right, so a policy or a program that seeks to redress past discrimination through active measures to ensure equal opportunity as in education and employment. Now, affirmative action is a very hot button issue, all right, but it is something that came out of the civil rights movement to try to address the poverty that was causing issues in lower economic areas. All right. We also have John F. Kennedy issued the first executive order, which made reference to affirmative action. All right. And yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, that's definitely one of the legacies. And that is where we're going to end today. All right. On Friday, you'll go through chapter 47. All right. Have a good one.